My own feeling is that if we want to get to something that we would say has a kind of autonomous intelligence, then we do need to give it agency, really, and we need to make it a living, autonomous thing, that it has some sort of causal insulation from the rest of the world.
Just if you look at the macro state descriptions of a very simple system, they can be completely deterministic and therefore kind of constrain the past and the future to a greater degree than any of their underlying microstate.
The way that I think we're going to get to a principled understanding of consciousness might be...
The reason why I say that the goal is consciousness rather than behavior is that
This is Brain Inspired.
Hi, my name's Paul. On this episode, we have a discussion with Kevin Mitchell and Erik Hoel. So Kevin is a professor of genetics at Trinity College Dublin, and his recent book is called Innate: How the Wiring of Our Brains Shapes Who We Are. And in that book, he describes the massive complexity of both our genes, but also our development, and how our DNA and our developmental processes interact and both give rise to how we turn out to be. And Erik is at Tufts University in Boston. Erik has worked on integrated information theory, which is a modern popular mathematical theory of consciousness from Giulio Tononi, whom Erik has helped develop that theory, and continues to work on using information theory to account for emergence and emergent properties. He's also a novelist, and his recent novel, The Revelations, is a story about some neuroscientists who are trying to come up with a good theory of consciousness. So our discussion is really wide-ranging. We start off talking about Erik's novel, The Revelations, and Kevin's book, Innate, and we talk about the process of writing and how their writing exercise and practice interacts with their science. We talk about consciousness and whether we have brains for consciousness or for movement. We also discuss emergence, the concept of agency and autonomy, and whether those are important for building AI that we would consider true, quote-unquote, AI. And there are a lot of other topics in there. There's really something for almost everyone. Show notes are at braininspired.co/podcast/111. I want to say thanks to my Patreon supporters. If you are listening and you get value out of this podcast, consider returning some of that value in the form of a couple bucks a month through Patreon. Go to the website at braininspired.co to learn more about that. So this is a super fun conversation, and I hope you enjoy hearing it as much as I enjoyed hosting it. Take care. Erik, a fresh congratulations to you, and Kevin, a stale, I suppose, if 3 years. Innate was written in 2018, right? Or published. I don't know when it was written. And Erik, a fresh congratulations to you, although I know that The Revelations, your book, has been a long time coming, and has, this is your first novel, correct?
it's my first novel, and yeah, about 10 years is probably it's probably the lower end of the estimate, although of course the bulk of the writing was done in graduate school.
Which is crazy. This
is not 10 years.
Well, I know people, and there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with 10 years in graduate school, everybody. But so this is the first on the podcast, I believe, where we're going to talk a little bit about a fiction book. And so we'll spend some time talking about The Revelations. I want to talk about Innate a little bit, Kevin, and then we'll come together and you guys will really butt heads about some of your some fundamental core concepts and ideas that you hold dearly. So
I've been listening to more of Kevin's like talks and so on, and my suspicion is actually that we agree on basically everything. Yeah. So
I think so too.
So it may be more of a head shake.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, we'll see.
So this is, to me, this is the conversations I aim for. I actually find debates mostly utterly unuseful. But anyway, we don't need to get into my thoughts on debates. So, Erik, among other things in the Revelations, it's just really impressive, the scope of the philosophy and the science that you cover throughout the novel. And it's a long novel, so you do have some time and space to do that. But it's also just filled with these really vivid descriptions of the science. And this is, maybe I should back up and say that the novel revolves around characters pursuing a theory of consciousness, and then things happen in the background, like there's a murder mystery involved as well. But like I said, there's lots of vivid descriptions of the science, but also the characters, what they're going through emotionally and their thoughts, and the scenes, and the writing is generally just fantastic. And so congratulations on writing.
Thank you so much. That's awesome to hear.
On the other hand, I'll say I felt almost like an old curmudgeon, partly because I am these days, but I kept wondering why these immature, children in the novel that are the characters were so like pretentious, and self-absorbed in their quest to understand. And I found myself grateful that I didn't know many people who held their own ideas in such high regard throughout my own academic work. So I am. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that's a very viable take, right?
From a curmudgeon, especially.
Yeah,
it's the youth, the energy of youth.
Yeah, so a lot of the novel is about, when there are dominant kind of modes of thought, particularly within academia. Oftentimes there are people who really, chafe against that. And in some sense, it's kind of necessary. It's very similar to the fact that, no one who is a billionaire didn't think when they were a kid, I'm going to be a billionaire.
Right.
But there are a lot of people who you don't hear about who thought that the same thing and they're not billionaires.
Right.
And so every billionaire has this, self-reinforcing narrative of like, well, I just believed it from when I was very young and look, it all worked out. And the same is probably true for scientific theories, particularly sort of grand sweeping scientific theories. One of the main characters, or the main character, Kirk, is looking for a scientific theory of consciousness, which he thinks there needs to be a scientific theory of. Even that is in itself debatable. Some people disagree, but he thinks this, and he is kind of monomaniacally throwing himself against the problem. And I wanted to draw similarities between the sort of anxiety that drives, I think, probably a lot of those discoveries, and things like creative endeavors like writing a novel or becoming a painter, or any of these other things that we think of as involving almost an artistic, romantic level of obsession. And I do think that probably at the upper levels of science, there is a lot more ego and humanness going on than it would be apparent from the outside. And my goal wasn't to say that the character Kirk, who is very strident in his opinions, so much so that he can sometimes be off-putting, is correct about everything. But I'm also not of the opinion that he is kind of irredeemable, or that this is, actually a very bad thing. I think in some cases it can be a very good thing to be like that.
Yeah. I mean, the other striking thing reading the novel, and of course I'm coming at it from a neuroscientist's perspective, and I also knew your background, or at least some therein, just looking through your publications, and so there's a lot of overlap. And I found myself, so I actually thought, I learned through another interview that you gave that Kirk, K-I-E-R-K, is Kirk, as in Kierkegaard. But early on, I thought, oh, that's an anagram of Erik with an extra letter. And because there are these parallels, a lot of overlap between the nonfiction of your life and the fiction of what happens in the story. And so I'm kind of wondering, because there are such, great descriptions, I think I even tweeted early on when I was reading the book, it's like you captured the world of non-human primate research like so well. You couldn't have done that had you not experienced those things and a lot of like the social aspects and stuff. So it makes me wonder where the fiction ends or where the nonfiction ends and where the fiction begins in the novel.
Well, it's a good question, and I'm not even sure that as an author I have a definitive answer that can partition out that boundary, appropriately. I think all authors draw a lot from their own experience and lives. Mine just kind of happens to be in this, world of like high performance science where there is a lot of, stress, and there's also a lot of really interesting things going on. I mean, all those descriptions, in the novel, these young scientists are coming to New York to study consciousness at New York University. They're in a building which is called the Center for Neuroscience, or CNS, which is very maze-like, so they're always getting lost in the CNS. And, there are primate labs in the building, and even the dynamics between, young people meeting each other for the first time can often be primate-esque. So there's kind of a mirror between the monkeys, and the people in how they interact. And, that's all based off of there is a real primate research facility at the CNS at, New York University. And it is a realistic depiction of the sort of animal research. And I didn't want to spare, some people have said, some reviewers have said, this is some really dark, very interesting, very dark descriptions of what's actually going on. And I didn't want to spare that because I do think that science alone is thematically interesting enough and dark enough to get the sort of literary treatment. I mean, it is an absolutely insane thing to drill open a monkey's brain, lower in a gigantic microscope into it, having, possibly reprogram the cells in the brain to respond to light, and then flash light, over the dark cortex and cause various, effects. And that is that kind of mechanism and work is so thematically dense to me that I felt I could only capture it if I drew from real life and real experiences. I do think that there's no way to cleanly separate it, but I would also say, just to quickly beg off like the quick Kirk to Erik comparison, that a lot of other characters also have a lot of me in them. So like Carmen, for example, yes, Kirk and I went to the same graduate school. So one might say, well, isn't it kind of obvious then? But like Carmen went to Columbia University and I worked at Columbia for years. So, her experiences at Columbia are, me observing things that go on at Columbia, right? So, a lot of, a part of me ends up in all the characters, and I wouldn't say that there's some sort of like immensely direct or obvious mapping.
I want to bring Kevin in a little bit because I have a bunch of questions about just the process of writing him, and what jumped into my head while you were talking about. I didn't think about this before, but I'm curious, Erik, about writing how the process of writing the more nonfiction, like the descriptions of monkey facilities and things of that nature that you're have a lot of experience with. Was that faster? Was that harder or easier, or faster or slower than the parts that you had to generate in your head?
Yeah, I would say probably somewhat similar. I mean, in terms of speed, the speed aspect, I mean, I'm sure Kevin can speak to this in the sense that I do think that nonfiction feels a very particular way. And when you're writing fiction, the goal is almost to somehow like transcend the subject in a particular way. Like in the end, the literary eye has to have a final say when you're talking about fiction. Like art is like the laughter, like after everything is done, right? Like the universe gets run out. It's just after heat death and it's cold and it's dark, but art kind of gets this last like chuckle, like at the end. And I think that that's true. Like in general, like when you're trying to describe anything, that art kind of has to maintain superiority, but it's very dangerous to go into nonfiction thinking about that sort of like romantic poetic angle, and you kind of have to go in very dry and very very skeptical and like non-romantic at all. So really it's much more about turning on and off like the more romantic parts of my brain when I write either or.
But you still have to go in, trying to write a readable book in nonfiction. And I realize too, there's different types of nonfiction, because writing a book about the history of dog shows, for instance, you're not really writing about the unknown. And much of the nonfiction that you guys both write, and Kevin in Innate, for instance, is all about, it's partly about what is known, but it's vastly about what is unknown and how we might be able to start knowing what is unknown and making connections. And I mean, so Innate is, a lot of people will have already read it, I'm sure, but it's kind of about the connection between genetics and development and psychology. So from like the really low level code, DNA code, to our psychological traits. And so that, in a sense, that's hard to pull off writing a readable nonfiction.
I mean, well. and the goal, I guess, I mean, I think of fiction writing as very evocative, and really making the words dance and making images appear in people's minds in a sort of a dialogue where the author is not necessarily directing everything, but more sort of inspiring a response in the reader. Whereas certainly what I was doing, it's not really evocative in that sense. It's really, I guess, not making the words dance, but maybe making them march. Trying to be clear enough that there's a sort of it's almost a kind of, I feel like it's a kind of mind control almost. You really have to have this sort of constant empathy for the reader to say, okay, well, what do they know? What are they thinking? If I say this, how are they going to take it? Never mind what the words I've said. How are they going to take it? And then do I need to explain something else? Do I need to give them, a metaphor or something familiar that they can take as a scaffold for an idea, that I'm trying to build up here? And I find actually writing that kind of nonfiction for non-specialists really fun, but it's a different challenge to writing, academic papers for very specialist audiences, where you can rely on the crutch of shared knowledge and shared perspective and shared assumptions. And sometimes the goal in writing the interdisciplinary stuff is to question those assumptions from any individual field and I guess try to recast things so that the relations between, like you said, genes and brains and minds can be seen in a particular perspective. And the perspective I was taking in Innate is a developmental one. The argument was that the only way to make sense of that relationship is through the prism of development.
And the take home, first of all, two things. One, the take home is that everything is messy.
Yes.
And development. So that's one of the take homes in the book is you have genes, you have psychological traits. They're not a one-to-one mapping. Everything is super messy. And we have forgotten about development as a process that gives rise to just tons of variation in itself.
Yeah, exactly. The idea that there's some genetic variation in our psychological traits is nothing new. But what I think was, the message I was trying to get across is that variation is realized through the processes of development. And like you said, there's no one-to-one mapping between, a gene for this and a gene for that cognitive traits. It's really complex, polygenic, and very indirect and sort of emergent relationships between those. And yes, the processes of development themselves are noisy in molecular terms. So you can start with the exact same genome and you won't get the exact same outcome every time you run that program, basically. So that's why, identical twins don't look exactly the same, and their brains are not exactly the same as each other, and their minds are certainly not exactly the same. So I think development is that third source of variation in our individual natures that's often overlooked, and in a sense a really important one, because it defies any predictability. It will never be predictable. Yeah. It's just inherently stochastic, which
it's a really down. It's a real downer. You know that.
Well, in a sense, but it puts a limit. it's interesting because it puts a limit on genetic predictability, for example. So the claims that you'll be able to sequence someone's genome or sequence the genome of embryos and really predict with some accuracy what their psychological traits is going to be like. You just won't ever. And it's not just that we don't know
designer babies.
Yeah, designer babies. Yeah,
sorry,
it's not just that we don't know enough now; it's that we never will. There's a firm limit in principle on how much we could ever predict from that.
Kevin, do you find that it's harder to attract attention arguing like a nonfiction perspective, wherein you're arguing from like a more skeptical perspective, like what you just said, right? Is a lot easier. It's a lot easier to sell the opposite.
I do think that a more sensationalist point of view probably would sell more books than a more the nuanced kind of picture that I'm trying to show, which is complex and it is messy, and at some point you just have to accept that. But it doesn't there aren't the strong headlines, like a strong headline is DNA is your future. That's a great newspaper headline, and people are going to want to read that. Whereas, the headline, well, it's complicated. That doesn't necessarily jump off the page in the same way.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's something I've been struggling with, myself. I mean, I think that the defining feature of like good literature is its agnosticism. You're kind of agnostic about almost everything when you're writing, like, whether or not this person is a good or bad person, you have to be agnostic about that. And whether or not, in the revelations, it's very much not that one particular hypothesis about how consciousness works is advanced, right? All the characters have a different take on that. And then when I go to write nonfiction, it's very much not agnostic, right? Like you have to put that aside and take some sort of strong, you're either a hardcore atheist or you're like a fundamentalist Christian or what have you, right? And that then you kind of argue firmly for this belief, and the agnosticism kind of is left aside. I don't know if you ever have that feeling.
I mean, in the sense, I guess what I was doing was taking a strong position against extreme positions. So I was arguing against genetic determinism, but also against naive empiricism, where everything is learned. So in a sense, there's an argument. Innate is argumentative in that sense. It's advancing a set of ideas. It's just that they're ideas in the middle. They're not ideas at one or other extreme.
So for instance, Erik, I know that you consider yourself a writer first, and an author first, perhaps, and a scientist. I don't want to say second, but because you're fully engaged in science also. But I know from an early age you have always wanted to be a writer. So in some sense, you consider yourself a writer first. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because I have this weird. What I really want to know is the right cyclical pattern for me and for anyone to like work on something and then walk away, but not just walk away, work on something else, right? And then when is the right time to come back to the thing that you were originally working on? And you have 3 or 4 different things you're working on. What is the right pattern? Because when you do that, when you go work on something else, whether, sometimes it's just taking a walk, but often it's also diving deep into another subject. And that's when the real insight comes relative to your first, for the thing that you're mainly working on. And there must be some right answer for people, in particular for each individual, for how long and what depth to work on something before moving on to another thing and coming back and revisiting and cycling through. And I'm wondering what your experience is, if you found the right rhythm with your writing. And Kevin, this applies to you too, because writing nonfiction is a different beast, and how much that informs your science and vice versa.
Yeah, the description of the cyclical nature of that is key. The reason I've described myself as a writer first is one that, of course, I want people to take the book seriously. I mean, I think that there's the standard take is something like, oh, look at this dilettante, who somehow found the time and like was incredibly lucky to get it published. And it's like, no, if you look historically, I grew up in an independent bookstore that my mother owned, and I worked there as a teenager, and so I always loved books and was surrounded by books and wanted to be an author first and foremost. But all my favorite writers wrote about, really drew from their background and experience. Somebody like Herman Melville going off and writing Typee after he gets stranded amid the cannibals, or Joan Didion finding the counterculture. Right. And it's like, well, I didn't know where the counterculture was, when I was 17. But I did find the nonfiction section of the store, and I realized that I could actually be pretty good at this. And that the world of science was itself incredibly interesting and rich, and really had been understudied from like a literary / humanities perspective. You can go back and read like C.P. Snow's The Two Cultures. A famous lecture where he's just bemoaning the lack of communication between the humanities and the sciences. And I think that that's still true today. And, I did, have this idea for the book, even in college. And I ended up, pursuing my PhD in neuroscience, at least partly in order to I knew that I would need to have that background. As you said, so much of the book, draws from reality and has that ring of, hopefully, has that ring of truth to it. And that's from, literally going and getting my PhD. With all that said, just to answer your question about how to, balance those things, I think that it is very, very helpful to work in cycles. I don't think that there's any way that someone can completely appropriately balance two very, very different fields. And I'm sure this even applies within Kevin's own scientific research, which draws from various interdisciplinary aspects, because just doing deep dives into something and then coming up is always going to be better than doing something shallow. So there have been periods of time, even like a year, where I just have not written a word of fiction. And then I'll start writing again, and, it'll all just kind of pour out. So I'm very, very much in this cyclical nature. I wish I could systematize it and tell people some sort of good, system to do it. But I think it's almost always by the seat of my pants.
Yeah. I mean, I would say something similar. I think the cyclical nature for me is somehow enforced by reaching a point where I'm just not making progress. Where I'm just trying to write something and I just can't. It's just not flowing, and I just need to go away and do something else. It's often when I've written myself into a corner, and actually I need to pull back from that, and going for a walk or something like that, or even just not looking at it for a week or so and coming back fresh. But also, I think before I start writing, there's a long period where I'm just kind of ruminating on stuff, and I'm reading loads and loads of different things, kind of thinking about them. I may be making notes and stuff. I might not even ever go back to the notes, but there's a sort of an active process there of saying, here's an idea I can use. And I mean, the ones I really get excited about, I guess, are where I'm trying to explain one thing and there's an idea that comes from another field, but actually it's very much the same process. And so it's some kind of insight that I can use there that is a kind of a cross-fertilization of ideas. That's, for me, that's the really intellectually satisfying, stimulating part of doing, the research for these kinds of books that are trying to make a synthesis of different fields. But then at some point I get to the stage where I'm like, yeah, okay, I think I can start writing. I'm just going to start. And then, I just carry on until I hit a wall again.
Guys, are you ready for the big showdown, the big debate?
I think we're going to vigorously agree.
Fine, I'll disagree.
What is it?
So, you guys apparently, at least on the surface, differ in the answer to the following questions. To the following question: what are brains for? In this corner, we have Kevin, who says brains are for action. And in that corner, we have Erik, who says brains are for consciousness. And I don't know. This was just, it happens. This was for some reason, to be honest, I don't know why I ever go on Twitter, but I saw that there was an exchange between you two on Twitter. And it was this exchange. So I don't know what the backstory is and how tongue-in-cheek it is.
I can't remember. I can't remember either. I do remember disagreeing about Marvel movies, but the consciousness versus action thing. I don't think it's a real versus there. I think it's well, for me, I think if you look in an evolutionary sense and you say what are brains, or more basically what are nervous systems for, I think they're for homeostasis. Actually, they're for helping the organism keep itself going. Right, to keep its all of its systems in the optimal operating range. And one way the organism can do that, of course, is sort of regulating its internal physiology, so reconfiguring its biochemistry, say. But another way it can do it is if it can't locally adapt to its environment, is to move. So, but the goal of it moving is to restore itself to homeostasis. So, for example, it might be hungry. That's a signal that its internal physiology is askew, out of the range it wants to be in, and then it can move in order to find food. So a goal-directed, reinforced kind of behavior. And of course, simple organisms, single-celled creatures like bacteria and amoeba do that. But nervous systems in multicellular creatures are really good for coordinating action across the whole organism, and of course they have built up this power of information processing. So rather than just having a single trigger that you go towards, you just doing chemotaxis, you can assess multiple things in the environment, and you can integrate that information and build up a picture of what's out in the world, and even predict things about what's in the world, and take action that anticipates things and so on. So you can get this sort of elaboration over time that nervous systems allow, especially when they have a kind of a hierarchy that processes more and more abstract things about the environment. And ultimately, I would say that ends with consciousness, where what it's processing is the goals and beliefs and desires that are being, represented or enacted within another part of the nervous system. So for me, consciousness is the ultimate means of, in a sense, controlling action, and it's still in favor of or in the service of this ultimate goal of keeping the organism persisting.
Yeah, I think just to follow up on this and maybe I'll try to say something radical, so Kevin and I actually have something to disagree about. To be like as radical as possible. A big concern of mine, and this is of course mirrored in some of the characters in the Revelations, is this idea of a scientific theory of consciousness. And the way that I would maybe phrase this is that right now, neuroscience has very good correlational measures. So we can do pretty good job in neuroimaging of correlating someone's experience to some particular brain state. But we have, one would say, no lawful measures. So we have no lawful way or relations. We have no lawful way to relate some ongoing neural activity to a particular conscious experience, like, classically the redness of red or the feeling of pain or so on. And if we don't have and my suspicion is that if we had a lawful way to do this, it would become very apparent that most of the brain's kind of architecture and design is based around instantiating this, basically stream of consciousness, which is kind of this dominant information flow within the brain, and that everything is kind of subservient to it in that it's feeding it or manipulating off of it or so on. And that this would be this would probably be a big paradigm shift, just in the sense that a lot of previous results would maybe look pretty incommensurate. And the reason why I say that the goal is consciousness rather than behavior is that, certainly I think that you need behavior to develop consciousness, and all these things. But I do think that it is true that most of the time for conscious experience, a lot of the world just does not actually filter as directly into behavior. In other words, it takes an immensely convoluted route. In the end, we're all Darwinian, and the reason that organisms survive is because of the way that they behave, right? Like that is incontrovertible. But I think that there's a view that I don't agree with, which is that consciousness is very minimalistic or almost epiphenomenal, or you're only conscious of a tiny, tiny top of the iceberg and everything else is going on. I think that that's wrong. I think probably, even organisms that we think of as having not very complex behaviors might have a very definite consciousness, and that is the thing that, much like for ourselves, that feels like it's kind of in control and so on. And so, this view is in my opinion, not quite as popular as it should be. And I would say that as a bit of an understatement, because if it's true, and I'm not, one could argue against it, but let's just assume for a moment that it is true, then the question of lawful relationships between neural states and experiences, it becomes incredibly powerful, and probably would probably sweep away a lot of contemporary neuroimaging or the way that neuroscience is done or so on. So that's why I stress this consciousness as primary approach, because it just is a change, and it's just so different, or at least somewhat different than how maybe the average neuroscientist, although that's very hard to figure out, right? Like what the average neuroscientist view is.
So I would agree in one sense that, first of all, that we don't have any good theoretical grounding of consciousness, really, or there's hardly much good theoretical grounding in neuroscience generally. It's kind of theory free, really.
No, I disagree. Hang on, I disagree. It might be good theory free, but there's a lot of theories.
Well, there's a lot of theorizing,
okay,
but we don't really have there's not a and this goes for biology overall, actually. We have one good theory, which is the theory of evolution by natural selection. That's our bedrock. And everything else around, beyond that is, there's loads of theorizing, but I don't think we have a solid framework. We don't have a standard model. But I don't mean to be dismissive of the work of theoretical neuroscience. It just hasn't gotten there yet. I actually think it's really important to be doing. But I would say, so the way that I think we're going to get to a principled understanding of consciousness might be in following an evolutionary trajectory to say, okay, well, if we think of nervous systems as as control systems, basically, then what does consciousness get you in that context? How does it better allow an organism to control itself by having that kind of a subjective experience of something going on? And when we get to humans, I think the idea that we've got what effectively is metacognition, so that we can, it's not just that we're having a conscious experience, it's that we can introspect about our goals and beliefs and desires in a way that gives us actually some control over them. I think that's a powerful sort of maybe addition to the arsenal that an organism can bring to bear in terms of maximizing its agency and autonomy over time. But when you're thinking about, say, a fruit fly, and I agree that a fruit fly probably has some kind of fruit fly consciousness, then the question is, what does that feel like, but also what does it get the fly above and beyond the control systems that are already built into its nervous system? Why does experiencing something help there? And I don't know what the answer to that is.
Well, what's so funny is that if you ask like an average person on the street and you ask them, like, what's the point of consciousness, right? They'll give you a very functional definition based off of things like, well, if something hurts, you'll move away from it, right? And if something feels good, you'll do more of it, right? And things like that. And, to be honest, I'm not entirely convinced we've even been able to supplement that in, the sort of artificial brains that we make with things like deep learning, right? Like, we're kind of cheating where we're kind of, we're basically just doing calculus about the input and output and figuring out, what what inputs you need to get to the output that you want. That's obviously not how biology is doing this. It's doing it off of somehow conscious experiences. Like, don't ask me how, or at least that's what it appears to be. And so kind of there is this very naive functionalist approach, which is just that, organisms have experiences, they have some sort of spectrum of affect along those experiences, and then everything they're doing is kind of trying to, maximize or minimize their affect along them. And that is, I think, a viable read, and might at some point reassert itself as a very viable read if you got a good, lawful relationship theory.
I think the only problem with that, Erik, is that you can build a lot of those sort of control systems into robots, for example. You can make a robot withdraw from things that are damaging, and you can make a robot go towards things that are rewarding. You can build reward and punishment into the circuits. And of course, when we look in animals, we can do these experiments now in mice or monkeys or other things where we're tweaking those circuits, and we're literally changing, not just controlling what the animal is doing, but controlling its cognitive states, controlling what it's thinking, basically. But it's all, the counter argument would be to say, well, okay, all that machinery is there, right? We're going to send a reward signal, we're going to send a punishment signal, the circuits are going to interpret it this way or that way. And the question is, why does it help for that to feel like something? Like if you build it in a robot, is the robot going to experience that? Is that where's the magic sauce coming from that converts the neural processing into a conscious experience, and why does it help? Is it just that it's broadcasting the signal to the whole nervous system, and that's just what that feels like? Does it inevitably feel like something, or does it add something functional to the mix?
Yeah, let me maybe push back a bit on that initial assumption that we do have very good models for how it works. So one is, I would say, maybe for some very, maybe for like aplesia, or something like that, we have very good neural models. The moment you get into something like mice, I honestly do become somewhat skeptical of, a lot of kind of the contemporary approaches. And now I know that sounds like me just like throwing out the whole thing, but let me just give an example of, I don't quite think that when I have like a Roomba, right? Yeah, my Roomba's doing various things that look like it's trying to avoid or go back home, or so on. And I think that it could very easily be that we're kind of fooled by this, where we think, well, this is a very reasonable explanation for like an animal's behavior, where it has some sort of almost like pre-programmed algorithmic, very simple thing inside of it that's, going to be governing it basically, in the same way. And you could say, well, maybe that's almost like a bit of an illusion, which is, and that actually what's going on inside an organism is like vastly more complicated and somehow rooted or grounded in the actual experiences it's having. And a Roomba just kind of apes that. And, while we can open up the Roomba and do experiments, and we can open up a mouse and do experiments, maybe they're just actually kind of a fundamentally different natural kind. And you could have a whole behavioristic science of Roombas, and our current techniques would work very well. Mm-hmm. But if you did it for mice, maybe the current techniques would only kind of seem to kind of work well enough that you can get publications and, do various other stuff, but they're not actually super effective as like a view of it. And again, I'm not saying that this is 100% true. I'm saying that I don't find this view represented enough. Yeah. Just a really kind of like hardcore consciousness first view of things.
Well, I think, so I wouldn't necessarily, I guess I'm very sympathetic to the idea that the approach I just described there of, digging into the neural circuitry of animals and tweaking this way and that way and showing that you can control the behavior. I don't think that gives us understanding necessarily. We can get control without understanding of what the organism is doing. And I think the reductionist sort of approach, really mechanistic, is just fundamentally wrong. I think these are, we have to think of these as organisms in concert with their environment as ongoing processes, really, that have a kind of causation that's not just instantaneous and mechanistic. And that sort of view is not really very very popular. And I see in a really vague sense how consciousness will somehow fit into that kind of model better than a mechanistic one. But I don't see exactly how. Obviously, if I did, we'd have a much better understanding of what consciousness is and what it's for than we currently do.
I'll bite on Erik's radical statement. I think that you loaded up the crazy train and headed out by going with the I'll just say something radical too, by going with a consciousness first approach. I mean, because there's so little evidence that there's so much evidence. So here's my pushback, I suppose, that I think there's more evidence that consciousness is the tip of the iceberg, whereas you're saying that there's more of the iceberg in consciousness than we appreciate in academia. I have that right?
Yes.
But the evidence I would suggest would be in my favor, I guess, or what you're saying is the rest of academia's favor, that the vast majority of our processing is unconscious, and we have. For me, I'm at home at ease with the fact that I have a very low dimensional, very minor connection to the rest of my processing, and that sliver of free will that I don't really have, but I think I have, is just. I'm barely conscious, essentially. I'm barely aware of what I'm doing and not in control at all, which is not a great feeling, but I've become at home with it. But I think that the vast majority of research would support that notion that it is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, so I disagree. I think that is a complete Freudian holdover, and that Freud's it is very difficult to overstate Freud's immense impact on ways of thinking from about 1930 to 1970. I mean, his complete and utter domination of the intellectual scene, and this idea that humans are driven by, mainly on sub or unconscious processes. And, Freud's theories, specific theories, have now been, pretty much roundly refuted. But his focus on the unconscious and the minimization of consciousness is, I think, still incredibly predominant. I don't agree that there's any good evidence. I mean, as far as we know, the only complex agential behavior that biological systems demonstrate occurs when they are conscious. There is very, very few or rare cases of somehow loss of consciousness and complex behavior, and they're very questionable. It's completely, you have to separate between whether or not you are conscious of all the information flowing in your brain, which is not at all a position that's even worth kind of discussing, and whether or not, in terms of a consciousness first approach, whether or not the stream of consciousness is completely necessary for the complex behavior that the organism is demonstrating. So, and these are two different things, right? And this is something like, your computer would be kind of non-functional without this sort of very nice top-level user interface kind of baked into it. So even if it's the case, and now the computer metaphor isn't perfect because, so let's take it as it is. But even if it were the case that you could claim that consciousness is relatively high level within the brain's, whatever term you want, representation, information processing. These are poorly defined terms that neuroscientists throw around. Whether or not the brain is very high level, it doesn't really matter, because what matters is if you take away the high level, does the whole thing just collapse? And I would say, both from a naive perspective of just people's understanding of other people's psychology and their own psychology, this is true. And also, there has been no good disproof. And most of this stuff are things like working memory papers that I think are kind of poorly generalized and things like that. So I actually do disagree about the predominance of evidence.
Yeah, so that's interesting because I would be more along Paul's line here, but I think there's a question, I guess, about, Erik, when you're talking about consciousness, whether, because it means so many different things, right? And if it sounds like what you're talking about is that it's just the organism is online, basically, that it's been booted up and it's active, right? And as opposed to the question of whether it has to be having subjective self-aware experience and be aware of itself experiencing things. And to me, I'm happy to buy the idea that the whole system has to be working for the organism to behave as it normally does, although I think that would look and feel very different for organisms of different level of complexity.
Yeah, I certainly agree about the looking and feeling to some degree. The only thing I mean by conscious experience is the Jamesian sense of a stream of experiences which are qualitative. So the what it is likeness, and so and if you're giving explanations about people's behavior, what you'll find is that you talk entirely in terms of their conscious experiences. Now, sometimes you might say something like, "Well, they unconsciously wrote a letter," or so on.
Well,
and now the standard, by the way, just to say this. I think the standard reply that I've heard from this is that it eventually gets down to people saying something like, well, when you add up numbers in your head, do you really do the addition, or are you kind of handed the solution, right? And I think that that's actually a reasonable take, but it doesn't mean that you could actually do, say, many of the things that you require consciousness to do unconsciously. But so this is the false step.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. But if we maybe frame it in a different way and ask about decision making and action selection, then I think all the evidence is really clear that most of the actions we take, we're not consciously deliberating about them necessarily. Because it just takes too long. We're on autopilot for most of the things that we do most of the time because we have these constraints built in to our habits, to our heuristics, to the policies, decisions that we've made before about what we will do in the future, which is all good and important because otherwise we'd take so long deciding everything that we'd have been dead long ago. So, in terms of... sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just just for that very specific example, I would say I think that again, some of this stuff is just linguistic. So, your point is absolutely correct, right? If we cognitively kind of made high level decisions of what we think of as consciousness, but the trick is that I think that that's a very different use of the word consciousness. A simple example might be like, let's say I reach for a glass of water. Now, you might say, well, did you really deliberate consciously about whether or not you would reach for the glass of water, before you reached, right? And of course, everyone would say probably not most of the time, right? And then, I don't think that one can at that point claim victory at all. Because what you can say is, listen, I kind of felt like this urge, like this whole thing played out within the activity of my stream of consciousness. I saw the water, I had an urge. I wouldn't have really analyzed it or described it. I wouldn't have spent much time on it. And then I, consciously reached out, grabbed it. Everything is again operating in the theater of my consciousness. And then I took a drink and I experienced, the sweet cold liquid.
Sure,
and that,
but there's
and
lots
that
of other,
is what I mean.
Yeah, but there's lots of other situations that are even less conscious than that.
Can I give an example? Because I burned the hell out of myself 2 days ago with coffee. So I have this, this is going to sound highfalutin, but I put butter in my coffee or whatever, and you got to mix it up. So I have like this aerator thing. Oh, stop grimacing, Kevin. It's okay. It's intermittent fasting. Anyway, so you stick this little wand in and it, spins really fast. And I had, and kind of like aerates the coffee, mixes up the butter and stuff. It's unsalted butter. And I had heated the coffee hot enough so that when I put the butter in, it wouldn't get cold. And right when I started aerating it, I pressed the button and it goes zzz, and for some reason it kind of blew up. I don't know. It's a butter reaction or something with the coffee. And in that, so my experience was nil. But what happened was I managed to take the aerator out. I did actually accidentally throw it across the room, but nothing was broken. And at the end of that experience, I was thankful that my body took over and perform these complex actions without me being aware of it. And you sort of like come to and realize, oh, I just did I made, a lot of degrees of freedom movements. And yes, the little wand is okay, but I did have to pick it up, because my body did kind of, what I'm trying to do is take it away from reflex and say it was more than reflex because I was making a complicated movement. But it was all unconscious, all my body. So just to throw that example as, I don't know if Kevin, you're going to...
Yeah, look, I mean, I think, again, there's lots of things that we do on complete autopilot where we're not even necessarily conscious of what we're doing at all. You can be driving along and just, drive to the wrong place because you're not thinking about it at all. You're just really not devoting much cognitive resources to that task at all, except a kind of a surveillance for danger and traffic signals and stuff like that. So I guess, I mean, it's sort of appealing to the system 1, system 2, dichotomy or a spectrum maybe of Daniel Kahneman. But in terms of decision making, I think the things that we do consciously and deliberatively, at least, are a small subset of everything else. But maybe it's semantic.
Yeah, I find it incredibly telling that the clearest example you have is basically a reflex arc.
That's what I was saying is
like
but
that,
it was beyond reflex.
But that I agree with, right? So it's very telling that, right, we immediately go towards something that we actually do all agree would be a kind of classic unconscious activity, right? Which would like putting your hand on a hot stove. And let me just say that even that, right? Like even particularly in your example, right? Now, if you didn't already have like the theater of consciousness set up such that you knew that it's kind of broadly available information about where your body is, where this thing is, all these things. And then yes, maybe you do have something that happens, so quickly in kind of neural timescales that you're only going to experience it once it's over. But it's still making use of all that information that you already had. So even in that case, I wouldn't be willing to say that your stream of consciousness had no kind of significant causal impact on what you did. And if even in that case, I feel like one can kind of possibly defend it, then I think that when we get to, more complex cases, it becomes more and more obvious. And again, I think that some of this stuff, as you said, Kevin, it is semantic, right? Where one has to say precisely what one means. But I think by focusing on this notion of a stream of consciousness and the degree to which that information is used, right, and necessary, then one gets, I think, closer to kind of, both interestingly enough, closer to the naive perspective, which is actually which is that human beings are experiencing these things and they're just basically reacting based off of what they're conscious of, and they have their various hedonic pleasures and pains and so on. When you get closer to, when you take this view of brain function, you also get a lot closer to the naive view, and I find that is probably a good thing and good evidence for it.
So can I push back, Erik, just on the I want to row back in time, as it were, evolutionarily. So if we imagine just an amoeba, say, and it's schmooing around the place and it's getting some signals from the outside about where, say, some bacteria are that it could eat, or where other amoeba are to form a fruiting body or something like that. So it's got information in that there are, it's got receptors on the surface. They're sending a signal internally when they bind some chemical. Therefore, there's a pattern inside the organism that has relative information, right? It's physically correlated with something out in the world. And it's configured in such a way that it responds to that by, say, approach or avoidance. So my question is, I guess, where is it experiencing any of that? Is an amoeba experiencing any of that? And if it is, then fine. You would say that's a kind of a proto-consciousness. Then that's fine. I'm happy with that. But if you think that it isn't, then at some point in evolution, consciousness arose where it wasn't there before, and then literally it's behavior first, consciousness second, as an add-on in evolutionary terms. But I'm wondering what you think about the amoeba, if it's having amoeba experience. I would say that's
dependent on the final theory, right? So this is the boring answer, right? Like this is the boring answer I can give is that, when consciousness arises is basically just a function of whatever this lawful relationship, is. And I don't know what the lawful relationship is, unfortunately. I wish I did. I can give some guesses, and we could talk about maybe at least one of the bigger theories, which is like integrated information theory, which is, I think, maybe it's not well accepted, but it's kind of well known and well discussed, and there are empirical studies that do support it. Like one should be clear about that. There are some good studies, although I don't think it's correct.
Slipped it in,
but it's reasonable to say just because I worked on it. So we should have. My personal opinion is probably that it's not the final theory, but it's a good theory. It looks kind of like what a theory should look like. And so to that I can't quite answer it, but maybe I could just say that the gap here is probably a bit bigger than people think, in that depending on what the sort of lawful relations you end up with, it could be very much that consciousness is totally epiphenomenal and only looks to be, it just so happens, right, that we experience something very unpleasant right when we are supposed to be acting like we experience something very unpleasant. Or it could be maybe very directly causally impactful. And I think for those sorts of questions, we need theories of causation. You need theories. I know, Kevin, you're interested in like theories of emergence and theories of consciousness. And I think that those things need to be resolved. Like my own personal preference, to be completely honest, is that I think that emergence is very solvable scientifically.
So,
Like, I don't think that there's anything in there, even taking very seriously everything that philosophers talk about. Like classic analytic philosophy about emergence, even taking all that stuff, let's just take it very seriously. Even then, I think it's completely solvable. And that feels very different to me than like consciousness, where, I have some ideas, but to be honest, I don't have any of the same certainty that anyone's going to crack it, in the next dozen years. I mean, maybe this is an opportunity to talk about emergence and some of the stuff maybe we do.
Definitely. Let's because I want to make sure we have enough time to go down that road. So, I mean, Kevin, one of the reasons why you're here right now is because you've been working on the evolution of agency and the emergence, essentially, of agency. And Erik, you have a host of recent publications examining how you can use information theory concepts to show that you can get more. There's more in the macro level than in the micro level. You can show that mathematically in these certain systems that you use as examples. I just kind of introduced those topics because I just want us to go down that road of, so maybe I'll start with here, Kevin, I'll quote you in a recent talk here. You say, patterns of neural activity have causal power solely by virtue of their meaning. Okay, so where does meaning come from? Let's go down this road.
Well, great, good. Okay, so that's really a pushback to the reductive view that, in fact, as we learn more and more about how neural mechanisms work and seemingly underpin things like desires and beliefs and goals and so on, the less work there seems to be for the desires and beliefs and goals themselves to be doing anything. Right? The mental content doesn't seem to have any efficacy there. It's just like, well, look, the neural circuits are firing that way and they're configured like this, and this is what's going to happen. So what's all this other stuff is just epiphenomena. And I think there's a strain, at least in modern neuroscience, that's quite reductive in that sense. And I think it's absolutely backwards. I think that those patterns of neural activity only have any causal power in the system because they mean something. So the system is configured in such a way that the patterns refer to something, represent something, reflect something, either out in the world or internally, that is tied through either evolutionary wiring that has sort of packed this program for configuring the nervous system a certain way into the genome, or through the individual learning of the organism through experience, such that the outcome is appropriate for the organism in light of the goals that it has at any moment. So, that's a long-winded way, I guess, to say that the organism is behaving as an agent because it has purpose built into it by natural selection, and the simplest things, single-celled organisms, their purpose is just to persist. But that's how natural selection works. Things that persist, and things that don't. So we see the ones that do. So that tendency is just wired in there, starting with biochemical circuits that maintain themselves going, and then moving to behavior when animals can sense things in the world that it is adaptive for them to approach or avoid, and then that behavior gets reinforced over time. So in that sense, the meaning is, first of all, a pattern of information that's correlated with something. So that's just, there's nothing controversial about that. Lots of things are just physically correlated with each other. But secondly, that it has some relevance for the organism in terms of its goals. So in terms of the purpose that it has. So it has some salience and some importance, and it's linked consequentially to some kind of action.
Yeah, Kevin, maybe you could say something about like the very first thing you said, right, which was kind of framing this, which is the reductionist drive within neuroscience.
Yeah.
But do you find it like almost overwhelmingly common?
Kind of, yes. I think it's not always explicit. It's often just sort of implicitly there. The idea that we can, first of all, we can break down behavior to the circuits, the components that are driving it, and we can control them with these amazing experiments, and that sort of reinforces the idea of a mechanism at play that we can intervene on and drive and manipulate. But then, below that, there's an even deeper sort of idea that actually, it's the circuits, that's all illusory. It's actually just atoms and molecules, and it's the laws of physics. It's a really deterministic view from physics. And this comes up in debates about free will, where people say, well, look, it's all determined by the laws of physics. You're just made of atoms. The atoms are going to do what they're going to do. What does you having a thought have to do with any of that? Nothing. It couldn't possibly have any causal power in the system, and I think that's completely wrong. It comes from a really impoverished view of causation, which is all basically bottom up, and it ignores the causal potential of organization, which is a trivial, commonplace sort of thing. Like, we know that organization has some causal influence on the way that things happen. But people bizarrely seem to just reject that idea, and I can't really understand why it seems to be so controversial.
Well,
it's actually quite funny because most of the time the people who are the most reductionist are often, not always, but often, all their science, in their particular science, its elements occupy some very high up place in the spatiotemporal hierarchy of physical objects, right? This is something that I've talked about a lot and have been trying to bring back as like a really big issue. If you say science is about reduction, you have to explain the fact that there is a huge diversity of scientific fields which all take various high-level components as units of function and causation. And I'm not by any means the first person to say this. Probably, I think one of the best statements of this comes from the 1970s by a philosopher, Jerry Fodor, who wrote something called like the unity of the special sciences as a working hypothesis. But his whole paper, and I think Jerry Fodor was probably one of the better analytic philosophers of the 20th century, is basically just saying, listen, you can't be a universal reductionist and still believe in science, because science contains all sorts of things where people just sort of stop at some particular level of description, and then they like don't want to reduce any further. And then his question is like, well, why don't you want to reduce any further? And he doesn't provide an answer to that, but he does point out that it's a really big problem. You basically have to dismiss your own field and just say, well, if we could, we would. And that's what I very much have been trying to show is incorrect and try to like prove is incorrect using simple, clear models.
Yes.
Because, the moment you start talking even about physics in general, you're talking about very complex systems that are difficult. But if you can show it in, say, cellular automata, then you can be reasonably sure that it's true, in the real physical world. So, all my research has basically been looking at things like cellular automata or like small, simple, Markov chains and simple systems like that. And then asking questions about, say, causation when you move through different levels or scales. And, you find some very surprising and concrete effects, which is that two macro states, by which I just mean some dimension reduction of microstates, can have a stronger dependency than their underlying microstates. I mean, it's almost like so trivially true that it sounds absurd, but as a very simple example, imagine I have 10 microstates, and those 10 microstates all transition to one another depending on what state you're in. So it's just a Markov chain, just 10 states. And let's say the first, three states, two of the states all are equally likely to go to each other. So A and B, if you're in A, you could go to A, you could go to B, equally likely, 50-50 chance, right? If you are in any of the other 8 states, you are equally likely to go to one of those 8 states. So you just bounce around, right? It's like this. It's like if you're in one of these 8 states, you just bounce around between these 2 states, right? If you're in these two states, you just bounce around within those. Okay, well, let's think about some of the conditional dependencies, which is the traditional way to talk about causation in that system. And what you will quickly find is that the macro states of that system, if you just say these latter 8 states are macro state, gamma, and the first 2 are macro state alpha or whatever, then you'll quickly find that macro state alpha has a deterministic transition to itself, and the other macro state also has a deterministic transition to itself. Even though the microstates are essentially choosing at almost random. So there's almost no the causal relationships of the microstates are immensely noisy. But the macrostate relationships, while there are fewer macrostates, they are deterministic. They're not only deterministic, that you can retrodict too. So now I have perfect prediction and perfect retrodiction, which in my research, this is called determinism and degeneracy. So you have perfect determinism and zero degeneracy, and you had a lot of indeterminism in your microstate model. And my argument is that if you want to choose between your models of the system, both are equally valid descriptions of the system. But one of those actually contains 2 strong dependencies, and the other one contains just a bunch of totally weak, noisy dependencies. And according to various metrics of causation, they can be higher at this macro scale. And I think that a lot of the time, it's not just that what you want to show to argue against like the universal reductionist position is not that somehow you can't do this reduction. Of course you can, because what philosophers call supervenience holds. But if you do the reduction, you lose something.
Yeah.
And quantifying that loss is what I've been after, and I've kind of proposed various measures, by which one could do this. I happen to think that the latest one, which is just using the mutual information, which no one can argue with the mutual information, which is why I love it. You can't get out. There's no escape from the mutual information. If you show something in the mutual information, you have to believe it. So, just even showing in the mutual information that you can break down the mutual information to 3 different types, and you can lose different types of information when you go down in scale. You can transfer from synergistic to redundant information by reduction. And so what this shows is that it's not just about compression, right? It's not just that, yes, everything should be, all our models of the world should just be physical models, but of microphysics, but we just don't have a big enough supercomputer. Like, we're not Laplace's demon, so we can't do it. It's like, no, Laplace's demon has a provably bad low information model of the world because he doesn't have good dependencies. The world that he sees is just completely indeterministic, and there's no boundaries, and the causal relationships are poor and uninformative, and all the information is redundant. It's not synergistic or unique. And when you think about it like that, I think that you can have a strong argument that higher level scales, you can talk about it philosophically, that they're like ontologically real, but certainly I think just talking about it in terms of method and when one should or should not reduce is probably the best way to talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, I agree, and I've really appreciated your work on this, because it I think really clearly shows that it's not the case that, like, someone like Sean Carroll, for example, the physicist, talks about these other levels of description, higher levels of description, as kind of convenient ways of talking about things. But the real truth is all down at the low level. And if we had the full picture at the low level, then we would have all the information that's there, and the higher levels would emerge from, in a very simplistic kind of sense, would be completely determined by what's happening at the lower levels. And of course, in an instant, they're instantiated in the low level organization, but that's not where the explanation lies for how the system evolves. And we have to have the right level at which to interrogate that and to understand it. And I think actually neuroscience these days is catching up with the idea that in any field of cells, for example, you'll have some pattern of activity, but it's got tons and tons of different possible microstates, and it actually is a trajectory through a sort of a low dimensional manifold. And depending on what the trajectory is, that's what the meaning of that state is. And then what happens in the system is based on the configuration of the filter, the set of synaptic connections, for example, that manifold goes through. And so it can be configured in such a way that if it's manifold A, this happens, and if it's manifold B, that happens. And all of the low-level information is just lost. It's too noisy to begin with, but it's actually actively filtered out by the nervous system. So that's what I mean, Paul, when I'm saying the nervous system is running on meaning there. It's meaning that drives the mechanism. And the meaning is inherent in the configuration of the circuitry. And it's been put there. It's been packed in there by evolution. So we have to think of it and by experience. So we have to think of causation not as this purely instantaneous sort of thing that just doesn't capture why the system is the way it is. There can be some instantaneous trigger, but the structure of the system has causality packed into it that is just often kind of ignored or seen as non-scientific. It was almost banished by, Francis Bacon, who was just saying, well, look, we've got just the efficient cause and the material cause, and we're not going to talk about formal causes and final causes in Aristotle's framing. And I think we're still suffering from that really narrow, reductive, both in space and level and time view of causation.
That's really interesting, Kevin. So, just in terms of like this notion of meaning, I'd be very interested in seeing some sort of, connection between, because meaning is kind of, you can think about it as like this very, very high level phenomenon, right? So it's kind of like almost like what happens if you dimensionally reduce enough.
Right.
Of course, in a sense, we are saying something a bit different, right? So, you're focused on this notion of meaning and the different sort of notions of, causation, like the classic Aristotelian. And I do think that that's a really interesting way to talk about these issues. But I want to be clear, I don't know to what degree it will kind of fully, like, I have not actually studied it, right? So I can't speak to like the truth or falsity of it. But I think it's a very interesting approach. Because I do agree that people take causation as this obvious primitive, and it's not, right? Like, you have to specify what you mean, right? And what you're saying is like, well, okay, let's be very serious about what you mean. In the example you gave of like someone like Sean Carroll, right? I mean, I think it's when somebody says something like all the information is at the bottom, right? So that is directly, provably wrong. So, but one has to be subtle. One has to be very subtle. So it's provably wrong because the type of information that someone's probably talking about when they say that is something like the Kolmogorov complexity or something.
Yeah.
where they're like, yeah, like, listen, like if you were to run a Turing machine that was running the world and you ran it at the level of microphysics, it would, the program that you need would be way longer than if you ran it at some higher level of scale, right? And that's like obviously true and totally irrelevant to any discussion about the causal powers of higher level scales. What instead you have to look at is, like a measure of causation or a measure of information. And you have to specify what measure you're talking about. And, like, for example, in the latest research that we did, we were using the mutual information, which you can break down into redundant, unique, or synergistic components.
Mm-hmm.
And what we showed is that, yes, you can have the same mutual information at the lowest level scale and at a higher level scale. But at a higher level scale, that mutual information, all those bits are synergistic. And at the lowest level scale, all those bits are redundant. Okay, so choose between your two models, right? You can have a model where everything is just redundant bits, or you can have a model where all the interactions are synergistic. And that synergistic effect disappears when you reduce it. So I want to be clear that synergistic information disappears when you do that. So when you say, if somebody says all the information is at the bottom, it's like, no, it's literally not.
Yeah.
And so I just think that this has been basically a massive confusion of people who weren't like sitting around with simple models and just like specifying what they meant. And then and also the confusion of reduction with like universal reduction versus like taking things apart helps you understand what they do. Well, that is very, very obvious, right? But also not completely true, because we obviously always stop at a certain point and declare kind of victory or declare that we have a good subfield of science here with these kind of primitive atoms of function and so on. So I really think that I hate to talk about free will, because I do think that consciousness comes in and is the wild card in this discussion. But certainly, I think one could even just say, just talking about neurons versus atoms, that there's a way stronger claim that your actions are caused by the macro states of your neurons than by the underlying micro states of the atoms that make them up.
Yeah, and
which I think is totally true.
Yeah, and I think a parallel way to argue that is, first of all, that I think physical indeterminacy is just not the case, that there is real indeterminacy in the universe. So that's a whole other discussion, and physics hasn't agreed on it. But I think it's right to say that the low-level details of any neural state, or the state of all the atoms inside a single cell, by themselves don't fully determine the next state. And so you've got some neural state, it doesn't determine the next state, and you also have this multiple realizability, in that many, many different microstates can mean the same thing at a macro level, which is where that causation comes in. So if the low-level details don't determine the next outcome of the whole brain, then you can ask, well, what does settle the outcome? And what I would argue, and many others, is that it's the meaning in the macro states that is what drives the system, and that's where I think agency, and ultimately what we refer to in humans as free will, can be found, because there's some causal slack in the system. It's not just reductive. The high-level things drive it, and that's basically what we mean when we say we're deciding things, is that we're doing them for our reasons.
I was going to ask a naive question, and this is about from both perspectives, I think, from both of your work. What role? So Erik, in your work, and again, this is naive, but when you make a macro state out of micro, you're making a move, but mathematically there's no cost to making that move. You just state it, and it happens. But in a physical world, in the real world, to create a macro state, there might be physical thermodynamical penalty cost, right, to actually instantiating that in a physical world. And this gets back to, and I don't know if we need to talk about this more, but the idea of constraints and boundaries and just environment, and the impact that the whatever system there is, the interaction with the environment, and how that relates to the information and that you can glean from the micro and macro states, and the emergence, whether emergence necessarily needs to take in considerations from its environment.
Yeah, so just to clear up a confusion, there's definitely no cost to like creating a macro state. I mean, like as a very simple example, when we talk about colors, right? Obviously, if I say, my wall is a certain color, what I'm saying is basically that there's some sort of macro state wherein if you kind of average together all like the colors of my wall, it'll end up being this. I don't really mean that every single, like the finer and finer you zoom in, that color is just completely consistently maintained, right? That would be the description of the microstates of all the colors. And then you could go even further and further, right, of all the states. So it's just describing something at a particular level. And just to differentiate, maybe just to try to differentiate Kevin and my position a little bit, because it sounds like we agree on so much, would be, on this notion of, for me, the notion of meaning does not yet have to come into play for many of these phenomenons. Now, maybe it does come into play with something like a nervous system. As I said, I'm like open to this kind of interesting notion of like macro states somehow gaining meaning. But just if you look at like the macro state descriptions of a very simple system, they can be completely deterministic and therefore kind of constrain the past and the future to a greater degree than any of their underlying microstates. And it's not a contradiction. So this is a completely non-contradictory thing to say. And I'll give you a very simple example, which is, let's assume that the macrostate we're talking about is your behavior. But again, this could be a very simple macrostate. I'm just using this as an example. I can predict what physiological macrostate you're going to be in about 12 hours. Right? You're going to be asleep. So, my guess off of your current macro state, which is like, you're awake and it's this time and you're feeling like this. My current guess is that I'm going to predict with like, let's say a 90% probability that you're going to be asleep, and that's going to be the macro state that you're going to be in. Now you compare that to like Laplace's demon, right? And you're going to say, okay, Laplace's demon, why don't you make your prediction now about what their future state's going to be? But here's the thing. I'm going to restrict you to talking about it in the language of microphysics, because that's what's supposed to be so special about you, Laplace's demon. So you got to make this bet in terms of microphysics. And Laplace's demon takes in your entire microphysical state, right? And then I say, okay, which microphysical state are they going to be in 12 hours, right? And Laplace's demon says, well, listen, I'm going to give you a really big list of possible microphysical states, all with vanishingly small transition probabilities. So I'm going to say, listen, you've got a 1 in a billion chance to be in this microstate, 1 in a billion chance to be in this microstate, and so on. Why? Because you're getting hit by solar rays, and like, oh, you're an open system. It's just impossible. So Laplace's demon makes this big list, and you say, well, listen, Laplace's demon, like the dependencies between the current state and this huge list of possible states, the dependency here is vanishingly small, right? You're just saying, like, you're basically not you're not even probabilistically sufficient, and you're definitely not necessary for any of these states, and so on. But my macro scale description, suddenly I was able to get a really nice deterministic causal relationship. And as Kevin said, the world, particularly at the microphysical level for open systems, even forgetting if physics is itself deterministic if you take the full state of the universe, but we're all open systems, and you're incredibly noisy. So, you really are gaining something by talking about it in terms of macro states. And I think that that's probably something that scientists are implicitly cueing in on when they find a nice field of study, because it's like, oh, look, I can intervene on things here and I get nice kind of deterministic responses. And, my theory is basically that what you want to do is you want to maximize the determinacy while also maximizing the size of the model that you have. So you want to find that sweet spot where you're as deterministic, your like your interventions to effects or the conditional dependencies are as deterministic as they can, and you haven't dimensionally reduced too much, because you could just dimensionally reduce everything into one big macro state and declare victory, right?
The interesting thing I think is that that's what the nervous system is doing, and it has to, because all those components are really noisy. And neurons are just not great information processors in isolation. And of course, you go from analog signals to digital and back to analog, and you're filtering all kinds of information and doing it really actively. Every time you go from one synapse to the next, that neuron's doing something. It's you're performing some operations on that information, either at a single synapse or collectively from one area to the next. So, I mean, in a sense, there's a cost to that, in that that's the activity, the work that the nervous system is doing. But on the other hand, it's far less work to do that than to try to transmit all the individual bits of information. In fact, it's pointless to just keep transmitting the same information along a chain without operating on it or extracting any, as I would say, meaning from it.
I was worried this was going to happen. I have about 400 more questions to ask you guys, but I guess my questions are microstates, and we'll have to let me ask one more question here, and I don't know if you guys will differ on this, and then we can wrap up. So the question is, do we need to understand life to build intelligence? In other words, is building artificial life essentially a precursor to building a necessary precursor to building artificial intelligence? And my gut tells me, Kevin, your work with understanding agency, trying to understand how agency evolved, would suggest that you do think that intelligence presupposes essentially life processes, homeostatic processes. And Erik, and I don't know where you land, but maybe who knows if you guys will disagree or agree, but that's the question.
Okay, well, maybe I'll jump in there. So it's really, really interesting. And I think in a sense, it depends on what you mean by intelligence.
Sure.
And there's been a tendency, especially in AI, to think of intelligence in terms of things like playing chess and, sort of logical, really cerebral operations. When, for most things on the planet, intelligence means behaving in a way that keeps you alive. I think intelligent behavior is things that keep the organism alive. So if you think of it in that sense, it's goal-directed behavior, and of course you can do information processing and cognition that underpins it. But my own feeling is that if we want to get to something that we would say has a kind of autonomous intelligence, then we do need to give it agency, really, and we need to make it a living, autonomous thing, that it has some sort of causal insulation from the rest of the world, and isn't just being, it's not just a stimulus response kind of machine, or something that's doing information processing in isolation from any real world goals. I think we need to give it a reason to care. And the easiest way to do that is to make it care about itself, because that's what life does.
What do you think, Erik?
Yes. I mean, again, hinging greatly on the definition of intelligence, right?
Yeah.
So I think to get the sort of agential behavior that the average person would say, oh, this AI is intelligent or something like that. Most people wouldn't even say that about Siri, right? Like why wouldn't they, right? Siri actually seems to know quite a bit. You'd be like, well, Siri has no animus. Like Siri just sits there and gets queries and spits back answers, and it's really not what we think of when we think about intelligence. But I would say I'm also a little bit, maybe just to finally bring this all in full circle, the sort of techniques that people use to build these artificial intelligences and so on look to me a lot more like cheats than the way that biology does it. Just like you're what you're literally doing is you're just rewiring the system until you get the answer that you want, right? And then you do that over and over and over and over again, and that's what backpropagation is. And it would be like if you were taking a test and you got certain number of answers wrong, and then your teacher rewired your brain such that you would have gotten those answers correctly on this multiple choice question, and then they give you another test and you're performing better on it. But what did you learn? You didn't learn anything. They just rewired your brain. You didn't have the experience of learning. You don't even feel like you've learned, right? You're just getting better at these questions. So I wonder if sometimes we are if we might have just discovered very different ways to do things, and that the concerns of biology, which might include things like metabolic efficiency and so on, just completely ignored all these sorts of solutions because they're not practical if you don't have good training and testing data, and they're not practical if you can't do post hoc regularization, and they're not practical if you can't do blah, 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 right? So I wonder if again, maybe what you really want for intelligence is something that's just conscious. And once it's conscious, it'll kind of look and act like us and, or not look like us, obviously, but it'll act like us. And, it just requires a total reframing, but we'll see.
I think actually just to pick up one thing there on the energy efficiency thing, I think if anything is going to drive a move in AI towards a more biologically inspired framing, I think it's that. Its power consumption is going to be the limit of deep learning and those kinds of methods. And there's going to have to be a rethink of however the hell it is that brains manage to do this on, whatever it's 20 watts or whatever, something like that. So I do think that there may be a radical rethink, which brings us closer to biological intelligence by virtue of having to be inspired by that biological design.
I certainly hope so, because, the fact that something like GPT-3 can, spit out a poem, and I don't think that it has consciousness or mind, I wouldn't say it has any of those things, is a horror to me. So, like, as a writer, like, I literally think it's a horror. And if you think about it enough, I think it becomes a horror. And so, I'd love for it to actually be conscious, because then at least, I'm competing against, an actual agent rather than just this like weird statistical summation game that is totally mindless and yet can put out good Shakespearean poetry.
So, Erik, that's a good note to end on, because I don't think GPT-3 actually has your vocabulary, reading the revelations, like the descriptions. I mean, a lot of it is borderline poetry, the way that you narrate and describe what's happening. I mean, it's really like just a pleasure to read so much of what you wrote in the book. So congratulations again on the novel. Kevin, I can't say that you write poetically in Innate. Maybe you're going to include some poetry. Is the new book about agency?
The new book is about agency and
I can't wait.
And ultimately free will. And I don't think there's going to be too much poetry in it. Not from me, anyway.
But anyway, it's very enjoyable on my normal reading level, which is the nonfiction. And so I greatly just enjoy both your works and research. Keep it up, guys. I really appreciate you being with me. Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's been awesome catching up in somewhat in person, Kevin.
Yeah, likewise, Erik. Thanks a lot.
Brain Inspired is a production of me and you. I don't do advertisements. You can support the show through Patreon for a trifling amount and get access to the full versions of all the episodes, plus bonus episodes that focus more on the cultural side but still have science. Go to braininspired.co and find the red Patreon button there. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. The music you hear is by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thank you for your support. See you next time.
The stair